Welcome back everybody to another MOTOBOB video. Now this week Triumph announced these two new little small to mid capacity bikes. We've got the Speed 400 and the Scrambler 400X. And while we've already published a full rundown of all the specs and details, today is actually the first time I've been able to get up close and personal with them with a camera. And so in this video we'll do a full walk around of the bike. We'll start at the front and work our way to the back so we don't miss anything, and hopefully give you a real sense of what these two new bikes really do look like and feel like in the flesh. So look, we'll start at the very front, and that's with the front wheel. And with this, you'll get a real sense of the two different intended purposes of these two different models. So over here on the Speed 400, naturally, with it being a entirely road focused bike, we've got a 17-inch front wheel, which generally is going to give you the sharpest handling and the most responsiveness. On top of that, you've got Metzeler Sportec M9RR tires, and it is kind of an interesting choice. I mean, that came up in the comments a couple of times on the video I published a couple of days ago, that perhaps this is a surprisingly sporty choice for a relatively small capacity sort of retro bike. But generally, I'd say that feeling sort of runs through the whole bike. It really does look like a mini Speed Twin 1200. It's got that slightly forward slant, and as we go through the rest of the spec, you will see that it really does look like it's built to handle. Now over here on the Scrambler, we've actually got a slightly larger 19-inch front wheel, so that's going to give you slightly better rolling over rougher terrain, but also not the full 21-incher that you'll get on stuff like the Scrambler 1200, which really is very off-road focused. And so yeah, I still think the majority of customers are going to ride their Scrambler 400Xs mainly on the road, but if you do want to do sort of light gravel work, and if you do live in a place where perhaps the road surfaces aren't ideal, then that might well make this one look a little bit more appealing. Now to match, we've got Metzeler Karoo Street tires, and they're sort of adventure tires, so majority road bias, but again also with a little bit of gravel ability, and they might dig in a bit better on loose surfaces. And you've also got a slightly different wheel design, so they're both cast aluminium, but this Scrambler looks a little bit like a spoke design. They've tried to give it a bit of that retro feel. Generally on retro Scramblers you will find spoke wheels, and so perhaps this is the best of both worlds. It gives it a little bit of that classic look, but you also get the lightness and ease of cleaning and the affordability of a cast wheel. In a way, I actually wish they'd used that more simplistic design on this bike as well. I think I prefer the aesthetics of that, but then you do also have to understand that they probably had to differentiate the bikes visually a little bit, and so this looks perfectly fine, but I think generally across the Scrambler I do slightly prefer the looks. Now let's move on to the brakes, and these are provided by Bybray, which is basically a more affordable sub-brand of pretty much the most famous brake manufacturer, Brembo. Now you don't quite get the same levels of premium finish as proper Brembo brakes, and also you'd expect the construction to be a little bit more simplistic as well, but in my experience of riding other bikes with Bybray brakes, specifically the KTM 390s for example, get pretty much the same braking setup as these bikes. You know, I've always found them to be really effective, especially on bikes like this that don't weigh that much. The Speed 400 comes in at around the 170 kilogram mark fully fueled, and then naturally with it being a bit bigger and having a bit more hardware, the Scrambler comes in at more like 179. And so yeah, I'd fully expect these brakes to be perfectly up to the job. You've got a decent 300mm disc, so nice and big, a 4-pot caliper at the front there as well, whereas some of the competition like the Enfield Hunter 350 might just get a 2-pot caliper. And also it's radially mounted, so the bolts holding it onto the fork leg go in line with the direction of the disc as opposed to sort of across it like you might get with axially mounted brakes, and that makes it a little more rigid, which should translate to a crisper feel at the lever. Now the master cylinder is from Bybray as well, and I've just given the lever a bit of a squeeze. It's not adjustable, but it does have a nice feel and quality and shape to it. And then at the rear we've got a single pot caliper on a 230mm disc, which is absolutely standard fare for a bike of this stature. Now up to the suspension, and at the front here we've got a 43mm upside down fork that I believe is made by Endurance. And again, if you compare it to bikes like the Enfield that gets a sort of regular right way up fork, you know, this should offer a little bit more performance and suppleness, because with an upside down fork you've got less unsprung weight. The chunky bit, the heavy bit, is at the top, and that means there's less work for the springs and damping to do, so it can respond easier, and that should lead to a better ride quality. These are also big piston forks as well, so instead of having a cartridge inside, effectively the whole fork leg acts as the cartridge, and that means that there's more oil and it can operate at lower pressures, and so generally that means better damping response at lower speeds. So stuff like dive under braking, that should be reduced in a big piston fork. Now there's no adjustability on the fork, which perhaps is to be expected at a bike bike of this sort of expected price point, but there is a bit of a difference between the two models. So this one gets 140 mil of travel, whereas the Scrambler is extended a little to 150 mil. Again, that's just going to give it more ability to soak up rough surfaces if you do take it off-road, and also sort of lifts the stance of the bike. I don't have a figure for it, but I'd expect there's a little bit more ground clearance as well. Now at the rear, we've got a piggyback shock, so that external reservoir should do pretty much the same job as the big piston forks. So more oil, more gas, and that means it can operate at lower pressures, which should mean better response and a little bit better ride quality. And naturally, the shock is preload adjustable, so you can adjust it to compensate for sag if you've got a passenger on the back. But that's pretty much it, no damping adjustment or anything like that. Again, there's a little more travel on the Scrambler, so 130 mil, I believe, on the Speed 400, 150 over here. And I really am looking forward to finding out how these bikes handle out on the road. I mean, Triumph generally do a great job of setting up the handling on their bikes. And from some of the equipment they've chosen, you know, the tires, the brakes, the suspension, these look more on a par with the sort of modern bikes in this capacity range, like the 390 Duke and 390 Adventure, than they do with some of the retros like the Enfields. Now moving up, we've got the headlight and the indicators, and specifically with the headlight, you've got some of the textbook styling cues from the Triumph Modern Classic lineup. So the Triumph logo in the middle there, a daytime running light around the edge, and then that timeless round shape with the sort of metal bezel around the edge. Genuinely does help to tie it in with the Speed Twin 900 and some of the other Bonnevilles like the T120, and looks a little bit above in terms of finish what you might expect at this sort of capacity and, like I say, expected price point. Specifically on this Scrambler, you get the headlight grille as standard. I really like the way that they've shaped it to still reveal the logo and the daytime running light. And of course, this is intended to protect the headlight from stones and gravel if you do ride it off-road, but I think also really contributes to that rugged, utilitarian Scrambler vibe. Indicators are LED as well, and again, I think they look really nicely finished. Unfortunately, I don't have the keys for this bike, so I can't switch it on and show you what it looks like. And then at the rear, I think one of my favorite styling points on this bike is the tail light and brake light, which has a bit more of a contemporary feel, and I think works quite nicely against the sort of overall retro aesthetic of these two bikes. Again, a nice little bit of detail with the Triumph logo in the lens there, and I also think it looks like it's going to be very visible out on the road, which of course is a great thing if you're thinking about safety. Now up here in the cockpit, the first thing you'll notice is this new analog clock. It looks a lot like actually the Speedo on like the Speed Twin 900. It's got that simple round layout, a similar size, but this one's a little bit different because you've got that LCD insert on the right hand side. Again, I don't have the key, so I can't fire it up, but here are some of the shots from the press kit. And while it is really in keeping with the rest of the bike, it's kind of interesting they didn't go with a TFT dash that opens up a little bit more functionality. I've mentioned the 390 KTMs, for example. They get a TFT display, and it allows you to do a little bit more with the information shown on there, but also offer things like a smartphone integration, which will allow you to control calls and messages and features like nav. This is one that tends to split the audience. Some people just prefer an easy to read, non-distracting analog Speedo, while others like a little bit of tech, and I think I would probably count myself as in the latter camp. But as always, let me know which you prefer down in the comments below. Now, just having a little feel of the bars, it's all quite familiar. The layout of the switches and the way that they look is pretty similar to some of the Bonnevilles, and also details like the grips, which have a similar pattern, and these bar and mirrors also look like stuff from the Bonneville lineup. But you can tell there's a little bit of a difference in quality. The plastics on the switchgear, the feel of the grips doesn't feel quite as premium as some of the more expensive bikes in their lineup, but I think that's to be expected. And actually, really, it's more important to compare them to the immediate competition, and I think these bikes offer a little bit of a step up. On the Speed 400 here, we've got some nice details like the Triumph logo in the bar clamp there, and over on the Scrambler, you've got a handlebar brace, a little pad there as well, and also some handguards which are standard fit, and of course they're going to help to keep your knuckles safe if you do off-road and protect them from branches and things like that. But also if you're just commuting in winter, they can help to keep your hands a little bit warmer too. Now moving over to the fuel tank, we've got a reasonable amount of capacity. I wouldn't expect this engine to be particularly thirsty, and from a visual perspective, I think this is for both bikes one of the key styling points. So on the Scrambler, we've got these knee pads on the side. It's a sort of classic shape, like I say, very much in line with the Bonnevilles, and then some nice details like the little Triumph logo. You've got a strap of color across the middle there, and some nice details on the filler cap with a little Triumph logo too. This one comes in this khaki color, which I think would have to be my pick, but you've also got a Carnival red version and a Phantom black. The Speed gets the oversized Triumph logo, which you'll see on bikes like the Trident, for example, a little more of like a two-tone finish, and that one comes in Carnival red, Caspian blue, and also the Phantom black. Maybe I'm a little bit biased because it's what I've got right here, but I think the Speed, I'd choose the red. The Scrambler, I'd go for this khaki. Now the frame design on these two new bikes is all new, and while it does look a little bit like a steel cradle middle that you'll see on the Bonneville, it actually stops about here, mounted to the engine, so using the engine as a stress member, and that's probably to do with weight saving. And like I say, it does look pretty favorable versus a bike like the Enfield Hunter 350. The other one would be the aluminium swing arm, and again, that's going to help with ride quality, reducing the amount of unsprung mass. And then the other nice feature you've got here is a bolt-on subframe and bolt-on passenger pegs. Typically on lower cost machines, these tend to be welded on, and that means if you do off-road the Scrambler, for example, they might get bent or damaged if you drop the bike, and unfortunately that's going to write off the whole frame. So this is a feature you'll see on many adventure bikes, for example, and so again, a nice feature to see here despite these targeting a lower price point. Now as for the engine, they're saying this is completely new as well, and it's a 400 single cylinder with liquid cooling, and so it makes pretty decent power figures, 40-ish horsepower up at 8,000 RPM and 37.5 Newton meters of peak torque at 6,500 RPM, and that torque curve looks pretty flat with a bit of a boost between 5 and 7 or 6 and 8,000 RPM. Totally competitive power figures, which really do put it right up there with the KTMs. And in fact, that's another thing that did come up in the comments on my video the other day. You know, these bikes are predominantly going to be built out in India by Bajaj, which is a large-scale Indian manufacturer, and it also happens that they make the 390 bikes and below on behalf of KTM. Now those power figures and the torque figures are really quite similar to the 390 Duke and 390 Adventure, and so while trying to say this is a completely new engine design, and it really does look different, the casings are very different, the exhaust header comes out the different side, I think, you know, I'd fully expect that Bajaj's expertise and experience have really fed into this design. Nice to know that you've got a ride-by-wire throttle, so that should feel nice and modern, and it does feel quite light, and I am looking forward to firing this one up. Generally trying to do a great job of tuning the exhaust sounds on their bikes. I think they get a lot of bass and character out of them given sort of emissions restraints, but yeah, no keys today, so we'll save that one for the press ride. Now just to give you some impression of what they might feel like from an ergonomic perspective, I'm about 5'9" or 175 centimeters, and this, the Speed 400, feels nice and low and actually pretty small. It feels pretty light to me to pick it up off the side stand, and also it sits low in the seat at 790mm. They've also made sure that the waist is particularly narrow, so the front of the saddle, and that does mean that I can pretty easily flat foot it both sides. So if you're a less experienced rider or not particularly tall, then this might be the one to look at. And the bar position and the foot peg position feels really neutral and typical of like a retro roadster. Now over to the Scrambler, and this one sits quite a bit taller, so 45mm taller, so 835mm in the seat. Now naturally, making videos for this channel, I get my fair share of tall bikes to ride, so 835 feels perfectly manageable to me. But like I say, if you're on the short side, this might feel a touch tall, and also the weight's held a little higher, and it is 9 kilograms or so heavier. Still feels small and manageable in the grand scheme of things, but out of the two, clearly this is the bigger bike. The bars are wider, they've also changed the head angle, so it's got a slightly longer wheelbase. Perhaps in the handling that'll bias it a little bit more towards stability rather than quick turning, and there's also a little bit more space down to the pegs, so this is a good one if you are on the tall side but perhaps looking for a little commuter or you're new to riding. And I think for me, even though I'm not massively tall, just that little bit of extra space and roominess makes this one a little more appealing. And I really do like the feel of the bars on this one as well, actually. A little bit wider, a little bit closer to your body, so you're more sat up and looking forward, and it's a very commanding feeling riding position for a 400cc bike. Now out the back here, you'll see a decent provision for a passenger, so you've got quite a sizable saddle. A single piece saddle on the Speed 400, it looks more like a split saddle on the Scrambler, so maybe there'll be like a rack accessory or something like that. And also a nice solid aluminium grab rail, which is great if you're a passenger, gives you a lot more confidence. And it's got some little pips on the back here, so it makes it quite handy for stuff like strapping luggage and bungees to it. Now this bike, the Speed, gets a single exit exhaust, whereas the Scrambler gets a dual exit. I think that's predominantly for styling, and there is a dual exit exhaust for this one in the accessories catalog, which I think does look quite smart. And perhaps the last difference between these two bikes is the final drive ratio, so there's a slight difference. I think it's the Scrambler that's a little bit shorter, so perhaps a bit more snap under acceleration, might compensate for that extra weight, whereas this one might cruise a little easier at speed, and that pretty much rounds off the two bikes. So it's been really interesting to get up close with these two bikes today. A massive thanks to Triumph for hooking this up. And I've got to say, the thing that I'm most impressed with on these two bikes is the level of detail and design they've gone to, despite them sitting as a new entry point into the lineup. And actually the build quality, despite being effectively outsourced, looks really up to Triumph spec. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of them, so do let me know down in the comments below. And if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next one.